Hello guys, I saw a lot of discussion on whether Zhuang Yan is a UN spy, a secret war breaker sent by the PDC to reveal Luoji's warfacer plan, and such discussions are often intertwined with mixed feelings towards the character Zhuang Yan and Liu Cixin's portrayal of her. Some readers find the portrayal of Zhuang Yan offensive to women, since she's so innocent and all, and her only role seems to be to fulfill Luoji's fantasy, while others argue she's not to be taken at face value, and that the author is actually writing about a UN spy, not some stereotypical female character. Liu Cixin's portrayal of women in the trilogy and all the discussions about it is an immensely interesting topic to me. When you look into it, Zhuang Yan and the love story between Luoji and Zhuang Yan are open to so many different interpretations. Luoji is one of the warfacers in the second book of the Three-Body Problem trilogy, Dark Forest. At the beginning of the book, he is a sociology professor who idles away his days. He explicitly says he's not to have any children, and that he thinks humanity had better not put up a fight against the Transolarians, and that people had better spend the rest of their days enjoying themselves. He is the high school classmate of Yang Dong. Yang Dong is Ye Wenjie's daughter. She is a physicist. She commits suicide in the first book of the trilogy. Yang Dong mentioned Luoji to Ye Wenjie before and described him as a highly intelligent man. When Luoji visits Yang Dong's tomb, he meets Ye Wenjie, who shares her ideas on the universe with him. And from these ideas, the true picture of the universe could be deduced, and this truth could be used against the Transolarians. So the Transolarians immediately make it their task to kill Luoji, and for this, the PDC makes Luoji one of the warfacers. It is not explicitly said, but the thing behind this should be that the PDC knows Luoji must be posing some sort of threat to the Transolarians, and that from the look of it, Luoji himself does not know what this threat is. In order to make Luoji find out his threat to the Transolarians, that is, to find out what his superpower is, so that human civilization could make use of this superpower in the war, the only way is to make him a warfacer without asking for his consent beforehand. Luoji is basically forced into this warfacer position. Unable to get out of the task and having no idea what to do, Luoji takes advantage of the resources he could utilize for his own pleasure and happiness, and even asks the PDC to find his dream gear. It is only after one of the warfacers, Frederick Tyler, kills himself, and that his wife and daughter leave him, does Luoji start to carry the weight of being a warfacer and set off to work, that is, to think about his plan. Then, of course, he succeeds in coming up with the Dark Forest theory and Tess's theory, and 180 years later, after the human fleet is annihilated in the Doomsday Battle, rises to victory with his plan and creates the deterrence. We'll talk about Luoji and his plan in a future video. For now, let's focus on Zhuang Yan. Zhuang Yan is Luoji's wife. Now I believe it wouldn't invite much controversy to say that the author creates this character to give Luoji a purpose, to make him grow, to allow him to change from a carefree man into one with the resolve and the sense of responsibility to save Earth's civilization. To get off the topic for a little while, not many characters in the trilogy have such an arc, except for perhaps Ye Wenjie and Yun Tianming. Yun Tianming does have a big arc, but the author leaves the story to the reader's own imagination. Ye Wenjie is more of an antagonist, and the author has to give a tragic enough story to back her betrayal against the entire human race. Of all the positive heroes and heroines, all the protagonists, Luoji is almost the only one with a complex arc. He is also the only protagonist that appears in big portions in more than one book. It's clear that the author intends to make his story not only one that's significant to humanity in this war against the alien invasion, but also a personally significant one. As I mentioned before, Luoji meets the readers as a largely carefree and somewhat irresponsible man, and the author intends to make him grow into someone who would spend 6 decades in absolute solitude, holding the ultimate button for the survival of human civilization, and this growth would be the arc of this character. Now, how to make this change happen? I don't know if a wife and daughter would really do that to a man, but it is pretty much the most probable thing one could think of. But to write a common love story and a usual family is certainly not special enough, and perhaps wouldn't have such transformative power to give somebody the strength to carry such weight. So, this love story has to be an extraordinary one. Hence, the author writes the most bizarre love story for Luoji, and this lady he's with is Zhuang Yan. Here's why I say this romance story is bizarre. Zhuang Yan is already with us long before she appears for the first time, as Dashi takes her to Luoji in that lakeside mansion. She appears for the first time when Luoji, on his flight to the UN quarters for the announcement of the Warfacer plan, dreams about a gear. And here the author tells us the story between Luoji and this gear. Luoji doesn't look like someone who would fall in love with a woman and start a family, but he does recall that one time he went out with a lady, a writer named Bai Rong, for quite some time, to the point where marriage is talked about. One time he's asked to write a novella for her as a birthday gift. While writing this novel, he creates a character and then falls in love with this character. Later, this character even appears frequently to the point where he thinks he has mental problems. A lot is written about his time spent with his imagined girlfriend, including a road trip they took together into the mountains. In the end, Luoji breaks up with Bai Rong, his real-life girlfriend, over this imagined romance. Apparently, this imagined gear is the one true love Luoji has ever had. So, when he has access to quasi-unlimited resources after he becomes a Warfacer, he asks the PDC to find him someone exactly like this imagined gear. He tells Dashi about the days he supposedly spent with this gear, how this gear looks like, how she dresses, how she talks, what her family should be like, and how her education background should be. Sometime later, Dashi brings Zhuang Yan to him. Zhuang Yan is exactly as he had imagined. Zhuang Yan says she's been told that she's to come here to work. She asks Luoji if he can really save Earth civilization, and is told by Luoji that her being happy is part of his plan to save Earth civilization. Luoji and Zhuang Yan soon fell in love. Over the next 5 years, they got married and had a daughter who is now 2 years old. And this day, Frederick Tyler, another Warfacer, comes over to confide in Luoji about his frustration at being reviewed by his wallbreaker, and then commits suicide. After this incident, Zhuang Yan asks Luoji whether it is really okay for them to live in happiness and oblivion while the rest of humanity is fighting for the future. And from the conversation, we can see that this is no way the first time she talks about this with Luoji. From Luoji's answer, Zhuang Yan apparently sees that he really is not working. That night, she left with their child, not necessarily voluntarily, but definitely willingly. And this serves the transition point for Luoji. According to the book, after Luoji creates the deterrence, he reunites with Zhuang Yan and their daughter Xia and lives happily with them for some time before they part again. The author says it's unknown why and how they part, but the author is hinting that by asking his wife and daughter to leave him, Luoji is protecting them and allowing them to live the life of normal people. They could do so only by leaving him, because he's to become the sword holder. Anyway, Zhuang Yan never appears again in the rest of the story. First things first, I love science fiction, and Liu Cixin is the greatest sci-fi author in my mind. Few in the entire history of sci-fi literature comes close to the Three-Body Problem trilogy. So sad, I hate to admit it, but everything about Zhuang Yan was just so gross to me when I first read it. I hate to use the word gross, perhaps uncomfortable is better. When I first read the book, that was before I read any review or discussion about it, I was uncomfortable with Zhuang Yan and Luoji, definitely uncomfortable. When I read that Dashi actually found this gear for Luoji just to fulfill his fantasy, and took her to his side in the name of working for him, and how the two fell in love in the Louvre, and how Zhuang Yan is such an innocent, angelical woman who unconditionally believes in, marries, and has a child with Luoji, and how she doesn't seem to be doing much or thinking much, except for to support Luoji, I must have said what the hell for 1,000 times. And it's not only the real-life Zhuang Yan, the perfect gear that Luoji creates with his imagination, who is introduced to readers long before Zhuang Yan, strikes me as boring the first time she appears. Note that she appears for the first time at the class of Luoji as one of his students. Then he takes her on a trip, and she buys some fish, and by the hearth in a hut, she marvels at how the red wine looks beautiful in the fire flames. If you look for what Luoji likes about this woman, it is her young age, her innocence, her being vulnerable and fragile. She's like a child that needs protection. She literally says she's afraid to go out into the world and look for a job after graduating from college. And since she just graduated from college when she meets Luoji, she's at this time probably 22. If you look at this from a feminist perspective, the character Zhuang Yan is almost the ultimate insult to women. She's a product of Luoji's mind, so she possesses nothing that goes beyond Luoji's mind. This calls to my mind the wife of the protagonist in Stanisław Lem's Solaris. But it's totally different in that in Solaris, this wife that comes back from the dead is the result of an imagined scientific process, and though she is something materialized from the male protagonist's mind, the man's memory is a real memory from his days with a real-life woman in the past. In Dark Forest, however, there's this imagery of this woman conjured up by Luoji first, and then Zhuang Yan the person in real life. What bothers me and some other readers is not only the fact that Zhuang Yan's sole purpose is to support Luoji, that she falls for Luoji without him doing anything to win her love, and the fact that she possesses nothing intellectually challenging, but also the author's portrayal of her. The words that immediately come to readers' mind about her are childlike, naive, pure, and submissive. In fact, the English text is already, shall we say, normalized to some extent. If you look at the original Chinese text, you'll have more of a sense that the author is painting Zhuang Yan as a young, innocent girl instead of a mature woman. For instance, here the Chinese goes, 她突然有了惊喜的发现，很孩子气地说. Literally, she suddenly found something surprising and said in a very childish way. The English is reduced to, all of a sudden, she exclaimed. In the original Chinese book, Zhuang Yan is almost always referred to as 女孩, literally the girl, while in English they are all changed to young woman. Note that in English-speaking countries, women of all ages commonly call themselves and are called girls, while the Chinese word 女孩 is only for young girls or young women. If you translate 女孩 word for word, it is female child. In the Chinese version, Zhuang Yan is once referred to as 美丽的东方少女, literally the beautiful oriental young girl. It is changed to this Eastern woman. And 现代已成为母亲的少女, literally the young girl who has now become a mother, becomes his beloved, now a mother. It is obvious how the wording in the original Chinese book could be kind of offensive to some readers, especially female readers. We could say this is only Luoji's preference and has nothing to do with how the author thinks of women. Yet when you look at how the author writes about women elsewhere in the book, you'll see it's hard to argue young age is not an important factor of a perfect romance interest in the author's mind. I asked friends and acquaintances around me who read the books on the matter. Well, not many. I asked 3 dudes, my husband included. None of them found anything wrong with Zhuang Yan. They say the author writes a perfect love story and a perfect family for Luoji, so that he'll grow after losing them. This wife and the family have to be perfect, so that they'll have the transformative power it takes for Luoji to rise to the occasion. So, to them, perfect is how they would describe Zhuang Yan, or at least they believe the author is writing about a perfect love story and a perfect marriage. Whether the portrayal of Zhuang Yan would be offensive to women is a moot point for them, and they are invariably surprised when I told them I felt offended by the portrayal of Zhuang Yan. I also discussed this with 3 female readers. 2 of them, knowing I'm a big fan of the books, actually came to me complaining about the Zhuang Yan storyline, saying they are, quote, disgusted by the portrayal of the character. One of them shared no such feelings. When I asked her how come she was not offended by the portrayal of Zhuang Yan, she said, I believe Mr. Liu only writes her as a tool to push Luoji to change. I don't think she reflects the author's real opinion on women. So what can I say but that it is astonishing how people's reaction to the same book can be so different. In the beginning of the 3rd book is a story set in the 15th century. The author tells us about the story of Helena's father. 多年后侥幸逃脱，流浪到君士坦丁堡，在那里他也确实遇到了圣女骑士团中的一个比他大许多的女兵，只不过他的命运一点都不比他强。In the English version it goes, after many years of bondage, he escaped and drifted to Constantinople, where he did indeed meet a woman warrior, a holy knight. However, her fate wasn't much better than his. The original text is 一个比他大许多的女兵, literally a woman warrior much older than him. We don't know how it matters if this woman is older or younger than him, except for that the author is saying this woman warrior is at once unattractive since she's old. The author also writes about Volodimov's family after he dies. Remember Volodymov? He is the director of the technical department when Cixin works under Thomas Wade. We later know that he is murdered by Thomas Wade. Here's Cixin looking into his death. Secretly, Cixin swept Vodimov's office and apartment with a Geiger counter, but discovered nothing unusual. She saw the picture of Vodimov's family he kept under his pillow. His wife was a ballerina 11 years younger than him, and their little daughter. Cixin wiped her eyes. Again, out of nowhere, it is mentioned that Vodimov's wife is 11 years younger than him. Apparently, being young is an important factor for an ideal wife, and having a young wife is an important factor of having a perfect family. Also, remember the French scientist on Thomas Wade's team who always has some problem with Cixin? She is the first introduced when Cixin is to bring up the staircase idea on a PIA meeting. When Cixin says she has an idea, people on the meeting all started questioning her. The original Chinese goes, 用资源改变原理。一个叫科曼林的上了年纪的法国女人用轻蔑的口吻说，她是来自欧洲航天局的高级顾问，觉察到了男人们集中到Cixin身上的那种眼光，她感到很不舒服。The English goes, an idea for bending the laws of physics? The speaker was an older French woman named Camille, a highly respected and experienced consultant from the European Space Agency. She looked at Cixin contemptuously, as though she didn't belong in the room. Here, the English is not that faithful to the original Chinese. The changes are obviously made to get rid of the supposedly sexist content. Note that the original Chinese is 上了年纪的法国女人. It could have been 年长的, which would be older, or 资深的, which would be senior, but it's neither. It is 上了年纪的. This phrase, literally advanced in the years, makes it clear that the author is not talking about Camille's seniority or experience in the work, but her relatively advanced age as a female. In the English version, Camille challenges Cixin and looks at her contemptuously because she thinks Cheng is too young or too inexperienced to assert her idea at such a meeting, as indicated by as though she didn't belong in the room. The original Chinese, nevertheless, 觉察到了男人们集中到Cixin身上的那种眼光，她感到很不舒服. Literally is, Camille notices how the men are looking at Cixin because she is physically attractive, and this makes her feel uncomfortable. In the original Chinese version, Camille's hostility towards Cixin arises from her jealousy towards another woman who's younger and who gets more attention from the men. From all this, it should be safe to say that the author has something against older women. That's why I don't think Zhuang Yan's being young, naive, and innocent is a singular case. It is a reflection of what the author finds appealing or attractive in a woman. Another thing common of Zhuang Yan in Dark Forest and the protagonist's wife in Solaris is that they both eventually chooses to leave the protagonist. In Solaris, this Rhea that comes back from the dead, who actually is an imagery the ocean produced based on the memory of the male protagonist, decides to leave after learning that she is not real. While in Dark Forest, Zhuang Yan leaves to push Luo Ji to take on his responsibility as the war facer. Now, Zhuang Yan's leaving is the one and only time that she goes against Luo Ji's will, at least the only time we got to know about. Luckily, it only takes this one defying action for this character to make sense. If without this defying action, Zhuang Yan's life would be a joke, but with this defying action, everything seems to be explained or resolved. Here's what we know about Zhuang Yan from the book. She is concerned with the survival of the human race from the very beginning. We know this because she asked Luo Ji when they first met, quote, Mr. Luo, do you really have the ability to defeat the aliens? This concern has always been there on her mind. We know this because when she asked Luo Ji whether it is okay for them to live in happiness in the face of war, it's made clear that she's asked this question multiple times previously. She also asked Luo Ji, who had claimed that her happiness is part of his plan, whether they can truly be happy when the rest of humanity is not. We also know that when she and Luo Ji fall in love at the Louvre, she had envisioned a language of facial expressions in front of the Mona Lisa, and they are now able to communicate with each other with eyes. And it is from Luo Ji's eyes that Zhuang Yan knows that he's telling the truth when he says they should just focus on their own happiness. And from her note to Luo Ji, which reads, My love, we are waiting for you at doomsday. And from what Sei tells Luo Ji, we know that she leaves Luo Ji willingly. The most important thing is that we know from Sei that over all the years she's been with Luoji, her soul was shrouded in melancholy, that she has this gentle sadness concealed within her clear, innocent eyes. This melancholy, this sadness, is the key to understanding Zhuang Yan. Even Luoji failed to notice the sadness over the 5 years, and only realizes this after Zhuang Yan leaves and after Sei reminds him of it. Why is Zhuang Yan sad? If what Sei says is true, that is, Zhuang Yan has been sad from the moment she meets Luoji, we could take her sadness as a symbol of humanity's desperation in this crisis. As a kind-hearted and responsible person, she is sad that humanity is to come to an end. She is sad that her offspring might not be able to live happily. She is sad because she is not as carefree and heartless as Luoji, and she cannot bear to live in happiness and oblivion when the rest of humanity is in misery. And, I guess, over the years this sadness only deepens, because deep down she has always known, and is knowing more and more for sure, that this war-facer, this man who's supposed to be a hero, this man with whom he fell in love with, has never truly taken up his responsibility. When she came to Luoji to work 5 years before, no matter how much of that is of her own initiative and how much of that is a PDC plan, she is seriously doing that to help the war-facer save the world. And now, knowing that this man she truly loves is not doing his work, to leave him is the only option. Some say Zhuang Yan is a UN spy, that she is specially selected and trained, that she went through cosmetic surgeries to look exactly like Luoji's dream gear, and that all she's done and all she said to Luoji are a carefully designed show. Well, before making this video, I read Zhuang Yan's parts again, and I admit that if you read it with this spy theory in mind, it holds water that all that she's done and all that she said to Luoji are for a clear purpose, to find out what Luoji is really thinking, and to arouse his sense of responsibility. Actually, for this character, there are a wide range of possibilities as to where the plotting and scheming ends and where the sincere stuff starts. Me, personally, wouldn't go for the theory that Zhuang Yan is a specially trained professional spy. We have Sei, Secretary General of the PDC, tell Luoji that her looks, her background, and her love for Luoji are all real, and I tend to take what Sei says as the truth, for the books generally do not play with such relatively trivial things. I suggest not reading too much into her story, and even if taken just at face value, her story still makes sense. She might not be a professional spy from the very beginning. She could actually be a kind, naive, and innocent girl that matches Luoji's imagination, and everything about her, including her love for Luoji, could all be real. But she must have come here with a mission, and she knows this mission very well. Perhaps she reports to Sei or the PDC from time to time on the status of Luoji, perhaps not, but she must be working with the PDC to some extent, perhaps tacitly. In one word, she might not be a professional spy, but she comes into the picture knowing her mission, and when it's time, she is willing to leave Luoji, giving up her family life for the greater good. The name Zhuang Yan in Chinese is homophonic to the Chinese word for solemnity and majesty. This seems to be hinting the nature of this character, that is, something noble and big. Of course, this is my own understanding. Since the author did not fulfill every detail, the story is open to all sorts of interpretations. Indeed, some say that her name, Zhuang, is a homophone to the Chinese word for pretend, and Yan is a homophone to the Chinese word for act, which seems to be hinting that she is putting on a show and that she is a spy. So everyone can have their own understanding. At the end of the day, whether Zhuang Yan is a spy or not, she fulfills her purpose. That tinge of sadness is the only difference between Zhuang Yan and Luoji's dream gear. It is all it takes to make this character meaningful. Having learned that Luoji is really running away from his war-facer responsibility, she makes the ultimate sacrifice, to leave Luoji. I call this the ultimate sacrifice because for all we know, she might not see Luoji ever again, and she is prepared to face this result when she decides to leave. First things first, I'd like to say that either the author is or is not sexist or anti-feminism. How he portrays women in his books is not driven by conscious feminism-related agenda. For all I know, when putting the story into words, Liu Cixin wouldn't bother considering how his portrayal of women would affect how his works were to be received by the readers. This is not a factor at all in his works. His strong suit is in the science and imagination stuff, and that is where he devotes most of his attention and efforts. He builds characters and weaves stories based on his understanding of men and women and how romance and marriage work, and it just naturally results in the stuff that's in the books. In an interview, the host asked him about his marriage and wife. He simply said something like, "You can imagine how a marriage was like in the 1990s. He was saying that his marriage is a regular one, nothing special, just one of the many common marriages at the time. And this is perhaps why, when writing about women and romance, he always tries to make them special. And for him, special means they should not be any common woman. But he forgets that most real women made of flesh and blood are common. They have to have their common thoughts, their common strength, and their common power, so that they'll be able to face the common vicissitudes of the real world. They should have their rough side and down-to-earth side. They are not little angels living in bubbles. The women characters produced by Liu Cixin are almost all like little angels living in bubbles. Unrealistic and blind, they sometimes are like symbols of certain qualities. They don't seem to be real-life persons. These women perhaps are special, but they lack the liveliness to make them interesting. IAA, in the third book of the Three-Body Problem trilogy, is already the most alive female Liu Cixin's ever written about. Apart from the examples I previously mentioned about the author's obsession over women being young, there are a bunch of other supposedly sexist things that got edited out in the English version. For instance, in the first book, here's this paragraph about Ye Wenjie looking back at her trauma.
For most people, perhaps time would have gradually healed these wounds. After all, during the Cultural Revolution, many people suffered fate similar to hers, and compared to many of them, he was relatively fortunate. But he had the mental habits of a scientist, and she refused to forget. Rather, she looked with a rational gaze on the madness and hatred that had harmed her.
Here, the original Chinese for most people is for most women. Many people originally is many women, and a scientist originally is a female scientist. These are edited out to make the text not sexist. By any means, it is unnecessary to stress the gender of Ye Wenjie here, for her feelings and thoughts described here should be common across genders. But in this paragraph, the author repeatedly stresses that Ye Wenjie is a woman, apparently because he believes there's something special about women and women scientists. Perhaps they are more vulnerable to madness and hatred. Perhaps it's harder for them to forget and forgive. I don't know, and the fact that the story stresses the protagonist's womanhood with no apparent reason is exactly why it is sexist. Apart from this, the author also tends to stress their look whenever the character is a woman, but not when they are men. This happens with the nuclear woman that is the bodyguard of Ye Wenjie, the female first lieutenant that interpreted for the attendees on a war meeting, and the receptionist at the Star Our Destination project office, where Yun Tianming bought the star for Cixin. The author invariably describes them as 漂亮的, literally pretty, and this description is all deleted in the English version. Also, in the second book, when gravity is chasing blue space, when this crew member is talking to Voronskaya, in the original Chinese, there is 艾克手指维拉丰满的胸部说, literally, he said with one finger pointing at Voronskaya's well-endowed bosom, and this is deleted. Also, when Sai appears for the first time to announce the War Officer project, the author introduces her as 她是继阿基诺夫人、阿罗约之后，菲律宾贡献给世界的第三个美女政治家。Literally, she's the third beauty politician the Philippines have contributed to the world after Maria Corazon and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. The English version got rid of this sentence and refers to Sai simply as this Filipino politician. In the third book, when Cixin and Luoji are reminiscing about Sai on Pluto, Cixin remembers how Sai once said to her, 你的声音很好听, literally, you have a delightful voice. In the English version, this is changed to, we need more people to think like you. So a compliment to physical attribute is changed to a compliment on Cixin's intellect. Luoji then says, 那也是个美人，这些年我也常想起她. Literally, that is a beauty too, and I've thought of her often through the years. In the English version, it is changed to, she was a true visionary. I've thought of her often through the years. When we look at such original Chinese texts, especially if we look at them through modern critical lens, the author is portraying these women in a stereotypical way. In fact, all the female protagonists he writes about, with Ye Wenjie as the only exception, well, in fact, including Ye Wenjie, have this out-of-the-world quality. They must not be the women we see in our daily lives. They must not be women engaged in matters of mundane everyday life. They are all in some sort of bubble, far away from everyday life. Ye Wenjie's bubble is her pursuit of morality. Yang Dong's bubble is her scientific pursuit. Zhuang Yan's bubble is her innocence and naivety. And Cixin's bubble is, well, strangely, Cixin is actually one of the most down-to-earth females he writes about. But still, Cixin is also someone with extremely few words. These women, including almost all the other women in his other works, have this quality. They are beautiful, they don't talk much, they are kind and pure, they seem to be creatures from another world, far away from mundane everyday life. Now that I've read the story many times, I've come to understand Zhuang Yan as a nice and wholesome character. But still, the uncomfortable feeling when I first read the story lingers on. And I'm not alone. Heated discussions about the female characters in the Three-Body Problem trilogy, especially Zhuang Yan, could be easily found on the internet. These arguments all boil down to this question: is the author sexist? Personally, even with all the arguments I made just now about how the author writes about women, I wouldn't call Liu Cixin a sexist. I would only say that his way of writing about women is traditional and old-fashioned, and that he's not good at writing female characters, because he understands better how men think, not women. I myself am a Chinese that majored in international journalism and English literature in my college years. That's how I got to know feminism and learned the fact that there are people concerned with and even examining the portrayal of women in literary works. It's also how I got to know the fact that there are people concerned with and examining the representation of different ethnic groups in literary works. In China, access to such knowledge is almost limited to people who study English and people who know a lot about Western culture, society, and literature. It's not that women's rights are perfectly protected in China or that China's achieved perfect gender equality. And it's not that in China there's no women's rights movement. It's just that the women's rights movement in China focuses more on practical things, like equal pay, paid maternal leaves, and men sharing more household chores and child care responsibilities. And we don't make it a habit of fussing over the representation of men and women in literary works or on the screen. For instance, if you open this Chinese mobile app for reading, it actually forces you to state your gender, and then recommend books based on your gender. Books are classified based on gender too. Romance books are called 女频多频, literally female channel books, while science fiction are all 男频多频, literally male frequency books. If in the West, this is outright sexist, it is outrageous and I'm offended by it. I don't want to be told what to read based on my gender, but then most Chinese wouldn't find this offensive at all. The thing is, if you ask an average Chinese person, chances are that they don't know about feminism as a concept or as an area of study in literature. Feminism is not in the narrative of Chinese literature study either. The concept is not mentioned in usual Chinese textbooks from primary to high school. It only recently entered China's public discussion domain, but still for most Chinese people, feminism is not a thing. And the author of the Three-Body Problem trilogy, Liu Cixin, doesn't seem to be aware of this either. He once complained about the US publisher who changes his text, saying that he couldn't see what on earth could be wrong with complimenting a woman's look in a novel. As I mentioned before, as someone who's never been educated about feminist stuff, he wouldn't even bother to think about how come you have to describe a woman's look whenever there's a woman, while you don't even think about doing this with male characters. This question wouldn't even cross his mind. It's just a habit of usual Chinese literature to say something about a woman's look whenever there's a woman character. I'm a Chinese female reader and a science fiction fan, and I love Liu's works to my guts. Though I do sometimes feel offended by his portrayal of women, I try not to focus on women or feminist stuff when I read science fiction. It's just like when Black Myth Wukong was out, they were trying to kill the game in the cradle by saying its creation team members are sexist, that they will said something that does not respect women and stuff. First, it was not true. Second, at the end of the day, why does that matter? All that game players care about is whether it is a good game. Similarly, all we should care about concerning the three-body problem trilogy is whether they are good sci-fi, and it is beyond doubt the answer is yes. Even in terms of feminism, the three-body problem trilogy is already doing better than most sci-fi works. Liu Cixin might be a complete nerd that knows nothing about women, he might be poor at female character building, his works at least feature female protagonists and antagonists, and the third story even passes Bechdel test. Not much hardcore sci-fi does that. By the way, people are also criticizing that his characters are blind, that the only thing in the books are scientific ideas and sci-fi stuff, and that the books don't have characters with a rich arc that readers care about and can relate to. Please know that this is science fiction. If you look at science fictions that are traditionally regarded as classics, the three-body trilogy is already among those with the richest characters. At the end of the day, is Liu Cixin sexist? It's still too harsh a conclusion to draw. He has nothing against women, it's just that people's understanding and thinking are defined by their environment and their growing up. The way he thinks, imagines, and writes about women is old-fashioned and nerdy. That is all. Alright, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I'll make more videos on the three-body problem trilogy. Bye bye.